Ezekiel's vision of the valley of dry bones is one of the strangest sounding passages in all the Bible. If there's no context for this passage, well, it sounds like a horror movie. It may be the Bible's version of The Walking Dead. Seriously, in Ezekiel's vision, there's a valley full of decomposing human bones, and those bones come back to life. They form a great army of skeletons. I'm telling you, it's a strange passage. You can read it for yourself, and you should, in Ezekiel 37. But what if I also told you there really was a valley of dry bones in Jerusalem during the time of Ezekiel's ministry? And what if there's a reason that this very passage made perfect sense to a people who had seen carnage from a war that we could not imagine? And what if this same strange sounding vision could bring as much hope to us today as it did to the first people who heard Ezekiel share that vision? When we're reading the Bible, context matters so much. Context is everything. That may never be more obvious than in Ezekiel's vision of a valley of dry bones. Ezekiel had been born in Jerusalem, but taken into exile as an adult a few years before Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC. When Ezekiel had his most effective preaching ministry, he was then living in what we call Iraq, near the ancient city of Babylon. In the meantime, the last few kings of Judah were in turmoil and trying to govern in an impossible situation in Jerusalem. So again, to be clear, Ezekiel was in Babylon when the last remnant of Jewish people were trying to survive in Jerusalem. They're in two different places. Now, of course, the people still in Jerusalem wanted their independence. But the Babylonian Empire was exerting more and more pressure on the region, and life was getting to be very difficult in the Middle East. Eventually, Babylonian forces surrounded Jerusalem, set a siege to it, and nearly starved the city to death. In 586 BC, Babylonian forces finally broke through Jerusalem's last line of defense, and they took the city. They set fire to the great temple. They destroyed as much of the city as they could, and they killed too many people to even count. Can you imagine the aftermath of such a battle? I cannot. Waking up after all of this is over, my mind will not allow me to really picture how horrible it must have been. But it was not the first time Jerusalem had been overwhelmed with death after a military battle. It wasn't the first time the city was overwhelmed with dead bodies. Do you remember Hezekiah, King Hezekiah? He was one of the great ones, one of the most faithful kings Judah had ever known. When Hezekiah prayed for relief more than a century before Ezekiel lived, God had answered Hezekiah's prayer with a supernatural victory of stunning proportions. Overnight, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers were struck down, and they died. The Assyrians still left the next morning, left Jerusalem as quickly as possible. Now, that was a great victory for Hezekiah. But what I'd like you to think about is the practical situation that was left behind. In a matter of hours, even as people began realizing that their prayers had been answered and that their enemies had been killed, they also realized they had a practical problem. They had a practical emergency. They had to do something with all those dead bodies. You cannot leave 185,000 corpses just lying around your community. It's a health hazard. If you don't take care of this problem, disease will become a reality. The city's water would become polluted and poisoned. So, what about all of these bodies? Where can you put all of these corpses? Jerusalem had two ideal locations for just that purpose. First, there's the very deep Hinnom Valley. Steep hills lead down into the ravine that borders the southern side of Jerusalem. This had been a trash dump for the city for centuries. So putting bodies in the Hinnom Valley would have been a practical solution to the problem of where to dispose of thousands of corpses. It's a horrible idea, I know, but it's a reality Jerusalem had to deal with. In your community, you have cemeteries and crematoriums. We have to deal with this too. You cannot leave dead bodies just lying around. It's a health hazard. On the eastern border of the city lay the Kidron Valley. It also was very deep. It also had very steep hills. If you could roll a body over the edge of the hill near the Temple Mount, that body would not stop rolling until it reached the bottom of the valley. Therefore, problem solved. That's where you can put all of those dead Assyrians if you are Hezekiah trying to clean up the city. And the Kidron was also already a place where Jerusalem had long been burying its dead. In fact, if you go to the Mount of Olives today, you will see that more than 150,000 graves are on that famous hill. You poke around near the bottom of the Mount of Olives in the Kidron Valley, you will find evidence that people have been burying their loved ones in this valley for more than 3,000 years. But in a war, there's no time to bury all of those bodies in some dignified manner. Whether it was Hezekiah trying to dispose of all those enemy corpses, or a handful of survivors in Jerusalem in Ezekiel's day trying to clean up after the Babylonian siege, it's almost a certainty that the Kidron and the Hinnom valleys became places where Jerusalem disposed of all of those corpses. That's gruesome, I know. I'm almost sorry to even bring it up. And I'm thankful I've never known the reality of war. I'm grateful I've never seen anything so horrible as this, and I hope you haven't ever seen anything like it either. But the point is, the people left alive in Jerusalem after the city was destroyed in 586 did see it. They had to do something in a hurry with thousands upon thousands of corpses after the Babylonians swept in and killed all those Jewish people. Now, there were some survivors, and they were taken into exile, just like Ezekiel. They were prisoners of war. They headed to what we call Iraq today. Ezekiel and other Jewish people were waiting on them. In time, more and more people were taken by force to Babylon. It was a long march, 700 miles or even longer. It was a death march. How many people must have died along the way? All along the way, the people walking to Babylon could not escape the images. Everywhere there were skeletons of dead bodies. It was terrible. And those who had actually seen the destruction of Jerusalem on their way to exile would have never forgotten the images that they had seen as they left. The city was burning. The temple was destroyed. The valleys surrounding the city of Jerusalem were so full of dead bodies, no one could cover them up. Do you see it? Those valleys, they were full of bones. Ezekiel missed all of that. He was living in Babylon, not in Jerusalem. But he heard the stories as people came to him. And he saw the look of despair in the eyes of those who had seen all of that death and destruction. And he comprehended that there was no hope whatsoever that Jerusalem would ever be rebuilt, that the temple would ever stand again, that Jewish people would ever come home. And of course, he knew that all of those dry bones would never come back to life. And Ezekiel's people knew that too. They weren't thinking of a symbolic message when Ezekiel spoke eventually of a vision of a valley of dry bones. They weren't thinking of this in a symbolic way. Some of them had actually seen a valley full of human bones. Discouragement for them doesn't seem to be the right word at this point. They were devastated. They were completely defeated. They were destroyed. They were in a place of great despair. But right at this moment, God gave Ezekiel an amazing vision and a message of hope. He set me down in the valley, Ezekiel said, and I walked among the dry bones. They were very, very dry. God asked Ezekiel, can these bones live? The answer seemed obvious, but God told Ezekiel to preach to the bones, to command them to live. And amazingly, Ezekiel did that, crazy as it sounds. And the bones began to move. Ezekiel said they rattled about. The right bones found the right place to reattach. They became an army of skeletons there in the valley. The skeletons were covered with muscles and flesh, and then God put breath back into those bodies, and they came back to life. Do you understand this message? Death was not the end of the story. Not when God got involved. Not even when the horror of war was a part of the picture. Nothing can stop God from bringing life to the dead, or in their case, from restoring Jerusalem to its former glory. God can do the impossible. You keep your eyes on Him. Indeed, only a few decades later, Jewish people began returning to Jerusalem. Then they rebuilt their temple. And by the time Jesus lived about 500 years later, Jerusalem had reached its finest hour. But can you imagine how encouraging that message of hope that Ezekiel had given to them must have been when they had seen Jerusalem's valleys full of death, full of dry bones? Coming face to face with death can be extremely discouraging, no matter when you live. If you've lived long enough, you probably know what it's like to lose a loved one. It's very painful. And you're probably like me. You're starting to realize that time is marching on. I know that my time on earth is limited. It seems to be getting shorter by the day. It is getting shorter by the day. That can be incredibly discouraging, even frightening. And I have an important question for you and for me. Is there any hope for my dry bones or for your dry bones? Of course there is. In fact, that message of hope comes through loud and clear in the very valley of dry bones in Jerusalem. There's hope for all of us. You remember the Kidron Valley, the most likely location for Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones. It's just underneath the temple. It makes sense. That's where this vision was taking place. Well, in that valley, at the base of the Mount of Olives, stands a church in a grove of olive trees. And underneath an olive tree, somewhere in this area, Jesus prayed earnestly that he might avoid a horrible death on the cross. Death was discouraging to him too. But first and foremost, most of all in his life, Jesus wanted to save you and me from a fear of death. He wanted to give us that certainty of hope of life after death. And look where he was as he prayed, as he struggled with this. He was in a valley that's covered up with tombs. He was in a valley that had seen so much death. Part of the history probably is Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones in that very valley. Jesus was praying there and committed to the idea that he didn't want you to face death, afraid that your life would end with your funeral. And so he prayed to the Father, not my will, but yours be done. Judas and a band of soldiers arrived a few moments later, and Jesus began his final walk toward the cross. And because of what happened on the cross, there is ultimate hope for all of us. As it was in Ezekiel's vision, there's a great message of hope in this valley of dry bones. If you will hold on to your faith in God, death will not be the end of your story. I'm telling you, if you know Jesus, you will know life after death. And if you don't have to worry about death, then you can find amazing peace as you live out your life today, no matter what your circumstances might be. Ask Ezekiel. Ask those who followed Jesus there in Jerusalem when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he was on the cross, and when he was resurrected to life. Ask those who know Jesus today. I'm telling you, when God's Spirit breathes life into us through Christ, then that life lives on in us forever.